Welcome, everyone. My name is Hallie Caldwell, and I'm a member of the Inspira Advantage team. Thanks for attending our MCAT 101, Everything You Need to Know webinar. We're going to spend some time walking through just MCAT basics. We have one of our fantastic consultants here with us today. Aditya, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
All right. Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. My name is Aditya. I'm currently a first year radiology resident at Mayo Clinic, Rochester. Went to medical school at the Mayo Clinic. One of the senior admissions counselors for Inspira. I do med school and PA admissions.
Great. Thanks so much for being here. Glad to have you.
All
So
right.
today,
Go ahead. Yeah.
oh, sorry. So today we're going to walk through just MCAT history, why it exists, the format and sections included in the MCAT, how it's scored, things to think about when deciding whether or not you want to take the MCAT multiple times or want to retake it, setting up a good study schedule, go over a couple tips, and then spend some time answering some Q&A questions. So a brief MCAT history here.
All right. Thanks so much, Hallie. So a lot of this information is going to be pretty cut and dry, going through kind of the structure of the whole MCAT, and we'll give some tips and tricks here and there for how to approach some of these sections and then ways to study for this test. But first of all, this won't be on the actual MCAT, but it just might be a little important to know what the MCAT is. It's the standardized test that every medical school applicant has to take to get into medical school. It is required. It is kind of how schools end up screening their applicants a lot of the time. It was originally made to kind of make sure that whoever got into medical school was ready for medical school. And so they make it purposely hard. So it's kind of like a rite of passage. If you're able to get through the MCAT, you're most likely be able to get through medical school and then, further on down the road.
Great. And so today, the most recent version of the MCAT came to be in 2015, and small changes have been made since then, but a portion, like a whole section was added, a writing section was removed, the MCAT was just like made longer, so longer duration of time, and there's more emphasis on biochem as well.
Yeah. So that was one other thing that was added, the psychological and sociological section. Another change for the entire med school application was the requirement of a psych and a sociology type course as well. And that'll be something that we'll be discussing in a different webinar. But that was just a big major change. And I think it's for the better. The list makes it a little bit more well-rounded, but it's been a while, and I think it's kind of a standard part of the process now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll take some time and dive into the format of the MCAT.
Yeah. So the MCAT is divided into 4 sections. Basically, we can look at it as 4 different subjects. We have like chemistry and physics is kind of grouped into one. There's some mixing of bio in that. You have your primarily biological section. You have your psych and sociology section. So that's more of the kind of on the spot, not really core knowledge, but more of just kind of like answering certain ethical questions and things like that. And then you have your basic reading section. We've all had the reading section before, the SAT, the ACT, every standardized test before this. It comes up everywhere, and it's really important for them to understand how well you can comprehend information. So we'll go through each one of those step by step. Each one of them has about the same length, and they have the same length of time for each one of those sections. And they're all multiple choice questions, I think standard 4 choice. So there's not really much deviation in how these questions are thrown at you. So the first section that you'll come through is chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. So that makes it seem like it's kind of combining 3 subjects in one, and that's kind of correct. That's kind of how they do it. So this section has 59 multiple choice questions. You have about 95 minutes for that section, and you can see the distribution is pretty kind of all over the place. You have your Gen Chem courses, you have your OChem courses that'll be incorporated into this. A very, very small bit of biology. Most of the biology is kind of incorporated into that new biochemistry emphasis that the MCAT had in 2015. Then you'll have some physics in there as well. When they try to incorporate these questions, it's a lot of like, maybe biological scenarios, like questions of like biological experiments, medical phenomena. For example, they'll say like, oh, here's a cancer that we're trying to develop a drug for. Here's the new drug. They'll maybe show like the molecule, or they'll show, okay, what was the reaction that happened that created this new molecule. So that's how they incorporate that biological context into a lot of these questions. The next section, if you can move the screen, Allie,
Yeah.
is pretty much your pure biological section. It's biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. Again, this one is also a 95 minute section, 59 multiple choice questions. Everything's pretty cut and dry. You expect the same thing with every section. And if you notice here, again, a little smattering of chemistry and organic chemistry, because they like to weave everything in together. But it's mainly introductory bio, your basic molecular biology, your genetics biology, and then you'll have a smattering of biochemistry within there as well. And they do this on purpose, just because kind of everything connects with each other. And that's kind of the trickiness of the MCAT, is we learn everything in such discrete blocks, but here they throw everything together and you don't know what type of question you're going to get. And that's kind of the skill that you learn through studying for the MCAT with a lot of the questions that you take. The next section is this newest section. I took the MCAT during one of the first years where this new section was there, and I actually really appreciated this section. I'd say this is one of the more quote unquote easier sections, just in the sense that you don't need to know your full core knowledge to really like get all the answers right. You need to know the psych principles, but with these questions, it may be a little easier to reason your way through the question and kind of get to maybe the best one or two answers, and then from there you have a higher shot of getting more points. So I consider this section the one where you can kind of rack up a lot of points. Again, it's 95 minutes, 59 multiple choice questions, and it's pretty much all basic psychology and sociology. For sociology, especially, I remember there was like a sample question that we came across one time, was like, what is the best definition of social capital, right? So that, that's not something you're going to read in a textbook. They'll give you four answers, and you just have to read all the four answers and see which one kind of fits best with what you're thinking. And there are variations where, oh, it's like value placed on something based off race, value placed on something based off class, value placed on something based off age, right? And then you have to kind of understand what is it in those answer choices that they're trying to make you differentiate between, and you kind of pick your best answer that way. So again, this is a lot of reasoning. You got to think on your feet. It can be intimidating, but it can also be a kind of a blessing in disguise if you keep a level head and you have a good foundation for this section. And then the fourth section, again, people can either love this one or hate this one, depending on, if they're more into the bio or they're more into the reading. I was more into the bio, so this was my pet peeve of a section, but it is still very important. This one was 90 minutes and 53 multiple choice questions. These are all passage related, so you'll have, these essays can be anything. Like, they don't have to be science related. They could be like history, like a different perspective on the American Revolution, whatever it is. And then from there, you can, they'll ask you a certain number of questions to see if you can understand what you just read. And they won't just be first order questions. They may ask you to infer, what was this character's motivation? What is the theme that they're really trying to go for? What is the thesis of this essay? So sometimes they can be pretty like abstract, and so you'll have to really understand what you're reading in order to answer these questions appropriately. And if I can make a comment about the previous sections, some of those questions may also be passage based. Like, for example, they'll give a summary of like a New England Journal of Medicine article, in a way that is like appropriate knowledge level for the MCAT, and then they'll ask you a couple questions for that, but they'll also sprinkle in some single questions as well, which is just pure straight knowledge. So those are the four sections of the MCAT. Again, pretty cut and dry for the way that they're organized, and what they offer in each section. The next section that we can kind of go through, is kind of how the MCAT is scored.
I think
So,
one more question I have that I know is not in this, but just think would be great to talk about is we did compare this a little bit to the SAT with having like the reading critical
yep,
analysis section. I think something that we all remember from SAT is it's a game and you
yep.
don't necessarily need to know all the answers. You need to know kind of the tricks behind it. Would you say that the MCAT is similar in that you need to know how to play the game, or it's much more straightforward like the ACT and just like they're not really
I think,
hiding things from you?
yeah, I'd say it's a bit of, they kind of incorporate both. So what I'd say for all the medical exams that I've taken, the phenomenon that I understand is like it's a bit of playing the game at first. So you'll whittle down your answers from four to two, right? And then you do need some knowledge base to differentiate between the final two answers. So you can kind of increase your odds, but you do need to have some sort of knowledge base to kind of get that final answer right, um, most of the time. And again, but the same strategies apply. Like you have to look at how the answer choices are organized, what is different between each answer choice because they may have symmetrical structures. And then in the back of your head, you also have to try to understand like what is it that they're trying to get you to understand, because that can kind of help as well. What is the topic? What is the concept that they're testing you on? And that might point you to the right answer as well.
Great. All right. Now we can talk a little bit more about how the MCAT scored.
Yeah. So this was also something that, changed, in like the few years before I took it. Like originally, like the MCAT was, like a double digit test score, like kind of into like the 30s or 40s, and then all of a sudden it changed to like this triple digit that kind of ranges between like high 400s to mid 500s. Regardless of those numbers, the MCAT is a scaled examination. So what you get is not an absolute score. Like you don't get, oh, I got 80% of the questions right. I got an 80% on the MCAT. It's dependent on, kind of the population of students that took the MCAT, with you in a certain time period, and then they kind of scale your score towards everyone else. So it's kind of like a curve. So the MCAT pretty much kind of shows you how far ahead of the curve you were in answering these questions compared to everyone else. And they've done this for so often, for so long, that like they can tell, what type of percentage passing is average and what type of percentage passing is like a standard deviation above. So they have a lot of stats behind it, but it is a curved test. If we can go a little bit deeper into the numbers on the next slide. So, back in the original slide, or sorry, in those section slides, one thing that was in each slide was like that each section was scored individually, about a scaled score of 118 to 132. And then you add all these scaled sections together to get your total score, right? So you could do really good in biology and chemistry, and then you may not do as well on the psych section, but you add everything together and you kind of get your scaled score that way. This scaled score, I don't really know the reason why it's these numbers. Sometimes I've always wondered that. It seems a little random, but, it goes from 472 to 528. They purposefully make 500 the midpoint. So 500 is smack dab in the middle. You are 50th percentile. When I was going through the application process, and when you look at kind of how your score compares to medical schools, you don't typically see the, score as much, or at least the way I was looking at it, I didn't look at the score, I looked at the percentile. So each one of these, numbers has a percentile with it as well. So you'd say, okay, like this school has an average MCAT percentile of 85. This school has an average MCAT percentile of 93, right? So then you're going to have a percentile with your score as well. And that's how you can kind of match up which schools you would have a good shot at. And that's part of the overall application planning process. After you get your MCAT, you pick your schools based off that. Most of them are going to be within your reach. So based off your MCAT, what are the, med schools that are within that range, and then pick some reaches outside of that range as well.
I think a question that gets asked a lot is what is a good score? And I mean, you'll talk about this, but there's not really there's not like a dividing line between this is a good score and this is a bad score.
Yeah, exactly. Again, since this is like a curved test, and each school has a different threshold for what they consider like the MCAT score that they want. Your goal should kind of just be, just try to do the best as you can on the MCAT on the day that you're doing it, right? And then you'll get a percentile rank, and then from there you'll have different options open to you. So if you, for example, get like very high into like the high 90s, for 90, like you get like a 95th percentile on the MCAT, right? That's a very, very good score. And you'll most likely have a good like a good shot at passing like the basic screeners for all the top medical schools whose averages end up being in that like 95th percentile, as well. So I think part of the question that students need to ask is what type of school they want to go to. If they're do or die top 10, that's a different scenario than something else, where if it's like, for example, if you want to go to your state medical school, or if you want to choose programs that are perhaps not as focused on academics, but have more of like a rural community focus, or things like that. They may not put as much emphasis on the MCAT, and so their average might be a little bit lower. So again, it just depends on what your preferences and what type of medical school you want to go to. So for whoever's listening on this call, maybe that is something to think about before you even start this whole process. In an ideal world, what is the type of medical school you'd want to go to? Look and see what their average MCAT acceptance rate is. And then from there, that's essentially your goal, right? When you're studying for the MCAT, that is what you're shooting for. And your study strategy is going to differ depending on how high that is. Another question that gets asked a lot is how many times can you take the MCAT? You can take it as many times as you or sorry, like I kind of overstepped that. So as many times as you want, like in like the worst case scenario, in a year you can take it up to 3 times. In 2 years you can take it up to 4 times, and then in a lifetime, as many times as you want. Hopefully, as many times as you want is less than 7. I haven't seen anyone taking it more than 7 times. There is a caveat, however. For example, if we compare this to something like the GRE, you could take it as many times as you want. It's really easy to schedule the GRE. You get your score right then and there. And you can selectively choose which GRE score you send to a school. For the MCAT, you cannot do that. They have certain times. You can't just take it on a whim. It's a lot harder to logistically schedule it, and then you have to show every single MCAT score that you take. The reason for this is for that standardized application service that they use, AMCAS, the AAMC automatically uploads your MCAT score. And because they automatically upload it, they're just going to upload whatever's in their system. If you take it 1 time, that's uploaded. If you take it 3 times, that's going to be uploaded. So what does that mean? Does that mean if you take it 2 times, you're kind of out of luck? Not necessarily. I've had a lot of classmates, a lot of clients who have taken it twice, and then, it ended up being a good thing for them. It just depends on that level of improvement. If you didn't do very well, for example, for the school that you're hoping for, and then you take it a second time and you're finally in shooting range of the MCAT average that they have, that's a good thing. Hopefully the medical school will respond positively to that. They'll see that you put in that extra work, and hopefully they'll reward that with an interview. If you end up doing the same or even a little bit worse, that's not going to look as good. If you look at it from the other side, if you're someone who's looking through the admissions process and you see someone who's taken the MCAT multiple times, like in your head, you're thinking, okay, they really want to get into medical school. How are they doing any better? Are they trying any harder? That's kind of what's going through their head. And kind of that score is kind of their shortcut to looking at that. If you're rising in that score, if you take it more times, that's a good sign for them. We would generally recommend that you not take it more than 3 times, because if you take it more than 3 times, that again is kind of a red flag where, okay, you're not able to really get substantial improvement on this MCAT even after the third time. Something must be up. We're kind of doubting your academic performance here a little bit. So there is a bit of back and forth with that. I would definitely say you could take it a second time if you feel there's substantial improvement. But usually, if you have that first score and you're within shooting range of some schools that you want to go into, that'd probably be the best thing to do.
And here's some questions that you can think about when kind of deciding whether or not you want to take it again.
Exactly. So how does your first score measure up? Again, this is going to be highly dependent on the type of school that you want to go into. For example, if you got an 80th percentile MCAT and you want to go to your dream school is like a 95th percentile average, you probably will want to take that MCAT again. That's something that I would want to do. I'd probably take that MCAT test again to see if I can bump it up closer to that average. And part of that is just kind of you have to be honest with yourself. How prepared were you during the MCAT? What was the postmortem like? What was going on during that time? Maybe you were taking the MCAT during the semester and you got way too busy. So maybe the next time you should take it during the summer, or maybe you were trying to squeeze everything in and not trying to take a gap year and you rushed the MCAT and now you're like you have the gap year to take it. You decide you're not going to apply, you're going to take that gap year, and then hopefully you have more time to take the MCAT during those months when you're working. And based off that, you got to learn from your mistakes. If you're going to make the same mistakes again, you're probably going to get the same outcome. So there got to be some changes.
So another question we get a lot is like, when should you take the MCAT?
Yeah, so the one thing that I didn't realize is when I was doing it was you can take it at any point. If you want to take it the first semester of college, be my guest. We wouldn't generally recommend that just because there's a lot of stuff that's on there that you have to get through, but you don't necessarily have to wait till the very end of all your pre-med requisites to take the MCAT. We would highly recommend that you take most of them, if not all of them, just so that you have seen all the information and nothing's like thrown as a curveball to you. But for example, in my situation, I was kind of in this situation right here where I didn't want to take a gap year. The latest I could take the test was in April of my application year. I took my MCAT in March, and during that same semester, I was taking biochemistry. So I was kind of pushing it a little close, but I didn't, that was kind of the beauty of that flexibility, whereas I didn't have to necessarily wait till I finished biochemistry, waste a whole semester, and then take it, and then potentially kind of have to derail my entire med school application timeline. So if it works better for your schedule, you can kind of do it concurrently, or you can kind of do it in between classes. There are some classes that are more high yield than others. Like obviously, make sure you have organic chemistry, basic physics underneath your belt. If you haven't taken your psychology course before your MCAT, not the end of the world. That is at least a section where you can pick up the core knowledge fairly easily, but more of the denser subjects, content and textbook wise, those would be the ones that you should probably focus on.
And the strategy, like taking it by April of your application years so that you can get your scores back in time for like
Yep.
start of your application and being able to strategically plan your application around your score.
Exactly. So April, it's about like a month or so after you get it's like quite a number of weeks after you take the test that you get your score. So if you take it in April, you'll hopefully get your score by May. May is when the application opens. You want to have everything ready to go by then, because then everything starts just rolling after that. Secondaries, interviews, and then things just speed up. So that's why we recommend April, because if you take it after that, then you're just not going to have anything ready in time, and then you might have to push back a year.
So when you start to think about studying, here's some things that you want to consider.
Yeah, so again, you have to consider what your MCAT test date is. Biggest deadline to watch out for again is that April. If you're trying to apply like in May, make sure you have that MCAT done the year before, latest by April. And some of you guys might be in school, some of you guys might be in busy jobs during that time. So you have to really figure out how much time do you have to study. If you're trying to take this during a semester, you're going to have to really be critical about how much time you have, and you can't slip up. You have to make sure you do the studying very diligently. You might have a little bit more leniency if you take it during a summer or during a period where you have vacation time, because you can have a larger day, you can have longer hours to try and get all the material down. And then what score are you aiming for? Two strategies. One person just says, I'm just going to do the best I can. And then the other strategy is if you have certain schools that you want to go to, and those are the ones that you really want to go to, figure out what their average MCAT percentiles are. And based off that, that is your goal, right? So obviously try to aim a little bit above your goal so that you have some room to kind of fall and still be at your goal. But that's another way to look at it. So depending on where your goal is, that can also change your study habits. And then part of your study strategy is also how well do you know the content. So if you did really well in school and you've been taking a lot of notes and you've been doing a lot of diligent engagement with all your classes, perhaps you don't really need to brush up as much on a lot of these subjects during your MCAT studying, and you'll more have to just focus on learning the exam. How are they asking the questions? Because that's a big part of studying as well. But if you don't know the content as well, you're going to have to factor in actual study time for the core content. So you're going to have to focus on learning the core content. And then after that, then you have to focus on how is the exam presenting it to me and how do I not get tricked by the exam? Because that's something that they'll try to do as well. So based off that, you have to give yourself either more time to or less time to study and make it work for your schedule. So again, just kind of reiterating, figuring out everything that you need to know about the MCAT. There are a lot of really good study materials that are out there. For the MCAT specifically, I would recommend sticking to the MCAT dedicated materials. Your classes at school might be great, and they might be very in-depth, and they might make you very knowledgeable, but there are certain criteria that the MCAT is testing, and they're going to test it in a certain way, right? So that's what you have to be prepared for. And it's not necessarily like testing how well do you know biochemistry off the top of your head, and how well do you know like the latest advancements in organic chemistry and things like that. So the way you can figure out your baseline, first of all, is, again, what I would do is I would go online and search up any like sort of free practice questions that I can get, or any free like pre-tests. So there's something that I can get my feet wet and really understand what are the types of questions that are being asked. How do I deal with those questions? How much are those questions throwing me off my scent for how much of the content that I know? Once you figure that out, you gather your resources. For me, I did the MCAT's study books, because for me, I felt that I knew the core content. I didn't really need to learn more content. What I needed to learn was how to do the test well. So for me, my emphasis was questions. I would just do questions, 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 questions. And that's how I would try to learn as much as I could. And then from there, you create your schedule. And your schedule is going to differ depending on what's going on in your life. So I was in a semester. So for me, I had to figure out, okay, I have my classes, and then where would I study either before or after class or during class, at least 1-2 hours every day. And then on the weekends, maybe I'll try to do a practice test. And then based off everything else that I had, I would kind of make this schedule and make sure that I kept myself dedicated. I think we have an example schedule on is it the next slide, or maybe the slide after? So we'll talk a little bit. Okay, great. Yeah, we can go through that one and kind of show you everything. But if we could go one slide back first, we can kind of talk about the importance of building the schedule. So you're going to have other things going on in your life, and that's totally understandable. You don't have to drop everything just to study for this exam, but you also have to give this exam its due diligence. You can't just walk into this exam or study for like a week or two and be totally fine, because it's not just studying the content, it's also understanding how they are asking you questions. So the more questions you do, the better you'll be at anticipating how they're going to throw things at you. One thing that you could do is list your strengths and weaknesses in terms of MCAT content, and this can be as granular as you want. A very simple thing to do would be, okay, like what are things that you might be better at, might not be as good at. So I was pretty good at organic chemistry. Like I feel like I'm good, but I don't know how good I would be in like a multiple choice situation, right? So maybe that's something I should focus a little bit more on. And then after you kind of go through all the topics and figure out which ones are the ones that you might need a little bit more work on, you start organizing your resources. So for me, I just kind of stuck to dedicated MCAT resources and tried to filter in as many questions as possible. And that's how I kind of got through all the material and then made sure I reinforced it with questions. And I kind of did something similar to what Hallie will show on the next slide as well. I took an Excel sheet and I did each row was a week, and then I did my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. A couple things I want to point out that this schedule did. So they just looked at basic like MCAT blocks. So like these are kind of like the core competencies within the MCAT, and so you just kind of dedicated one day for each. And so, for example, if this was my schedule, I'd say, okay, it's like Monday, I'm going to do like 2 hours of general chemistry. Maybe I'll do some practice questions, and then Tuesday will kind of be like a catch up, review those practice questions, and maybe review some other topics that I had some questions on. And you can do this however you want. Like, you could just do one day is something different, or you could do week 1 is just general chemistry. And then week 2 is just biology. One thing that I did that was a little bit different than this one, or like so they did practice questions like kind of every 2 weeks. Like I did kind of practice questions every day, and then I had practice exams every Saturday. So every Saturday I would not read anything. I would just do the practice exam. So I'd sit down, do the whole thing, and then just review it afterwards. And then Sunday would be the rest day. And so that would kind of be how we would go through everything. So there are different ways that you can do this. For example, if like I like things to be a little bit more random, and so I just like did all the questions. I didn't filter them, but you could do something a little bit more structured. Like week 1 is just general chemistry. Week 1 is just the end of week 1 is general chemistry questions. Week 2 is biology. Week 2 is biology questions. So there are different ways that you can do this, but again, the emphasis is it's very important to have a schedule, and don't just like do 1 week, I'll figure out the next week at the end of the week. No, you should at least have like 5-6 weeks out in advance, and you can have some leeway, but like make sure you have that there so you can hold yourself accountable. Because if once you slip up once, it may be easy for you to like stop following the habit, and then it just kind of spirals out of control from there.
And I will say we do have a webinar on our website about how to create and stick to a study schedule for the MCAT. Some of this information is in there as well, but it goes a little bit deeper into that also. So some tips as you're beginning to jump into MCAT studying, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A.
Yeah. So tip number 1, this is not a test that penalizes wrong answers. So don't leave any answers blank, because it is definitely incorrect then. Even if you're down to 2, pick the one that you feel the best and kind of move on, hoping that you got that one right. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So take those breaks. You have to build that endurance. That's why you can't just like study for this for 2 weeks and sit for this exam. Like you have to study for a couple months, build that endurance, learn to sit down for a couple hours and take those blocks of questions, and then you'll be ready for the actual thing. The third tip, so first of all, take a pretest, or they call it a diagnostic test as well. That way you can at least know in your mind, like how much work do you need to put in? Like if you're doing really well already, maybe you just need to reinforce some things. But if you are getting a lot of things wrong, you got to put in a lot more work. Your schedule has to reflect that. And then you have to keep taking regular practice tests to track your progress, because it'll give you a projected score. And hopefully that projected score keeps going up and up until you get to your goal by the time the test is being taken. The earlier you register, the more you'll be able to hold yourself accountable. If you have that test in 4 months, you have to get that study schedule done within 4 months. Like there's no question about it. And this is kind of like a second job in a way, right? You have to study, you have to put in the work. It's not just a class you can blow by. So treat it as like your number 1 priority during that study period, along with everything else that you do, and hopefully that'll take you through.
Fantastic. We covered quite a lot of information today. So we'll leave the Q&A box open, so feel free to pop in a couple questions that Adita can answer. They can be about just general MCAT questions, specific questions. Throw anything at them. And while we keep that open, Adita, do you have any other tips, thoughts, anything we didn't cover here that you think is important to know when starting the MCAT process?
I think not not really. I mean, it's a lot of gosh, like I like again, like my the only tip that comes into my head right now that I keep wanting to emphasize is again, it's all about questions. Like knowing the content is not going to be enough. Like you need to know what curveballs they're going to throw at you. So you need to do as many questions as possible. Like that is going to be what consistently keeps your score getting higher and higher as you study for this test.
Well, next time we run through this webinar, we'll have to add a slide that just talks about questions.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. It looks like we have a question. We have someone planning on taking the MCAT in the summer after sophomore year, but they won't have taken biochemistry by then. Is it doable to take the MCAT if you've taken all the other intro courses like bio and chemistry and physics, but not biochemistry?
Yeah, so it can be doable. Biochemistry is one of those courses that is a little content dense. So what I would recommend you do is see if you can find an MCAT prep book and look through that biochemistry section and see kind of what's your gut feeling. Do you feel like you'd be comfortable with that information or not? And if you feel like you'd be comfortable with that information, just go for it. Just in the back of your head, keep in mind that that's going to be a section you should probably reinforce more than the others just because you haven't taken that course yet. But if you're looking at everything and everything just looks completely unmanageable, then you might have to consider changing your MCAT schedule. But I think it could be doable. Biochemistry is not as bad as if you didn't take organic chemistry and you're trying to jump into this. It's a lot of just kind of knowing the molecules and pathways of things like glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, things like that. But if that's something you feel comfortable with, go for it. Just look and see what the questions are like and what the content is like on the tests, and you'll kind of know your answer.
That might be one of those things too, where if you decide to go for it, maybe you don't get as great of a score as you want, and then you take biochem, you can continue focusing on that area, but take the exam again and hopefully have an improvement there because you've had some more context for the information.
Yeah. I got another question. Oh, yeah, right here. Okay, great.
All right. Well, Aditya, thank you so much for being here today and walking us through this information. It's always great to have you. We're going to send out an email after this webinar with a recording, so you have it for your records. It'll also be on our website. And then keep an eye out for further webinars from us starting mid-January. We'll be continuing to do these weekly. So yeah, thank you all for coming. I hope everyone has a really great night. Adita, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ali. Thanks so much, everyone.
Good night, everyone.